I always attempt to kind of be the comic relief because I know I had to come to a lot of these back in the day, and they could be a little dry. See, there's the party. Now we got some folks coming in. Cool. So this is a little about me. Basically, this is my 20th year at IT. I've spent a very long time kind of on the other side of the aisle working for large enterprise customers as an enterprise architect or a cloud architect, virtualization, that kind of jazz. And at Rubrik, I'm the chief technologist, but primarily I also am the product manager for our APIs. I lead all things open source, and I run our tech marketing team. So I'm very fortunate to run a team of a lot of very nerdy people, of which I am part of that. And we do nerdy things in the cloud and have very strong opinions. So when I was asked for this presentation, I said, what do you want me to talk about? They said, we really like to hear your opinions on cloud and things of that nature. So I put together some trends, some things I'm noticing. Maybe there'll be things that you nod your head with or smile or vehemently disagree. Those are kind of the reactions I'm looking for, very strongly opposed or aligned to these ideas. Does that sound fair? Hopefully that's what you're in for. We'll talk a little bit about Rubrik too, but that's kind of later. Yeah, it's all groovy. Thumbs up. You can give me the Vulcan peace sign. The evolution that we've been dealing with, and this is a journey that I've been going through with various companies as well as my own team for probably 14 years now, is really this new model. People like to bandy about DevOps, but I call it circular building as opposed to linear building. The idea of having these feedback loops are quite interesting, and they're actually quite challenging. So the fact that everything's real time now, the gig economy. I was reading an article this morning about folks in Hollywood, California that are renting pods. They literally don't own an apartment, don't own a car, do their laundry at the gym. What they own now is data, which I thought was kind of interesting. These millennials and even kind of the next generation after that, they own Instagram photos. They own information on social media. They don't really want physical things anymore. And that's driving some of these new models, right? It's just kind of interesting to think about that. And so rather than physical inputs and outputs, it's more around the data inputs and outputs. And I think that does reflect kind of positively to what cloud has been migrating towards, as well as observation versus monitoring. It used to be if something peaked from a CPU percentage, you'd alert, and people go, what does that mean? And I think they still do to this day. And now it's more about what does the end-to-end experience of that application look like? So those are some interesting musings. The other one was open source. Anyone follow kind of the open source world a little bit? I can never quite tell. Sometimes I'm surprised. It's actually a very volatile environment right now. A lot of money exchanging hands, mostly into the cloud provider hands, which is actually kind of fun. And it's being viewed as a strategic investment like never before. Because I remember when virtualization was seen as like this antithesis of data centers, and now it's kind of like normal, right? In fact, now it's kind of containers versus virtual machines and serverless versus those things. But there was a time where that was just not done. It was the anathema of data. Now we're seeing it as a strategic investment. And what these public cloud providers are doing, and really just all cloud providers, is they're saying, these are some great ideas out here in the open source world. The folks of Redis Labs and MongoDB, and there's a long list of these different open source technologies for handling data and services and user experience. And wow, Red Hat finally got acquired. The only open source company that has reliably made money off of open source is now part of the IBM portfolio. How do you feel about that? Kind of quiet. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of how that could potentially pan out, but $32 billion feels pretty good in someone's wallet. And MuleSoft, $6.5 billion for different API exchanges and ways to get one piece of software to ultimately talk to another piece of software. And Jeff Bezos very famously stated back in 2004 that all of Amazon would be driven by APIs. There would be no back-end channels. Each service would be independent of one another. And now we're starting to see the fruits of those labors put into this kind of money being bandied about. I even put, it's very small under there, MongoDB is currently valued at $4 billion, and it's completely open source. You can just download it right now. Elastic's IPO, Elasticsearch, $6 billion. So a lot of money in this environment. It's quite interesting to me. And a lot of friction. Right? So Amazon says, yeah, we'll give you MongoDB. Just come over to here, and you click a few buttons, and you can have that. And MongoDB is like, hey, that's not cool. I'm not super jazzed up about that. Elasticsearch as well, worth $6 billion for IPO. And then now they're just trying to kind of regurgitate that as a service. And so there's this war going on. So just kind of wanted to make you aware of that, just because we all tend to live in our bubble. And once in a while, it's good to see what the other bubbles are doing. And so far, I'm tracking, just shy of $500 billion exchanging hands in this market, which is, for some people, that's petty, whatever. For me, that's more than I have, so I tend to pay attention to it. So it's a lot. The other one, if I can, is observability. And I appreciate the warm introduction there about observability. For those that aren't super aware of the term, it's more of, instead of tracking metrics like CPU and memory and storage consumption and looking at kind of the values of different pieces of metrics, it's more around how are we actually measuring the performance, the user experience, the reliability, and those kind of things around an application. And it's driving a pretty big disruption in not just public cloud or private cloud, but really all of IT. I thought was kind of interesting. And I put together this quote from a company named Honeycomb.io, Charity Majors. She's amazing. She's the CTO or CEO of this particular company. I had her on our podcast to talk about observability. If you're into that sort of jazz, look up the Datanauts. And she said, really, it's just, do we understand what the system is doing? And I would think in a lot of cases, the answer is maybe not, or probably not. And I thought that was an interesting way to pose how we look at our services and the applications and the environments that we run. And as they get more and more complex, this becomes a bigger and bigger challenge. So the companies that are aimed at providing observability for applications is certainly an area that I personally focus on in the greater space of IT. I think there's still a lot more we can do here, and Honeycomb is one of those companies I tend to follow. Understanding a system can be broken down even further, though. And there's a long list of things here that I'm not going to read. The one I will kind of point out is enablement. It's kind of an interesting one. The idea that as we build systems, we also need to enable people to consume them. Documentation and the like, training, services around that. There's entire companies that really just make this their mission. And I thought it was interesting because it doesn't stop you from deploying an application. Enabling people doesn't stop you from building a feature. Neither does security, which is another one that I get on my high horse about quite a bit. So these things don't necessarily stop you from shipping code, but they are certainly things that are going to add technical debt that you have to pay down eventually. So I thought this was interesting. This actually came from a manifesto that Google wrote about site reliability engineering. And these are all things they consider when they're shipping code. Whether or not you like or dislike Google is really irrelevant. This is just how they look at services when they build them at scale. Because originally when they decided, hey, we're going to scale this thing, how many engineers do we need? It was right around 2 million sysadmins to run Google. They said, but that's going to be tough. There aren't that many. And so they put these things into mind when they built out these services. And now all of Google is run by around 2,500 engineers globally. It's kind of cool, right? And then the last one, I think it's the last one here, is the API economy. Have you heard this term? It's kind of like digital transformation. It's on every marketing thing you've ever seen. It's actually about a 15-year-old term now. And it's realistically just the idea around the fact that pieces of software tend to like to talk to other pieces of software. I'm sure we've all heard of PayPal. I think they're around $12 billion right now. I think somewhere in the order of 90+% of that revenue comes from licensing their API to other people so that they can transact business through their API, through their platform, which I think was kind of interesting. I highlight the bottom there where you're describing and you're collaborating on an API. And we're all going through this journey where we're like, okay, let's embrace public cloud and private cloud and really just let's distill that down to cloud. Well, clouds are built on these things. That's how they run. And therefore, I actually made a statement that got a lot of snark on the internet. By the way, I quote myself sometimes in slides because ego is just boundless. I can't help it. But I said, as an enterprise architect, I feel like there's a limited amount of runway left, and everything's a little bit different depending on vertical. But I said about 3 to 5 years left to really understand what this means and how it applies to your environment before you kind of start facing that irrelevance curve. It's something similar to what I think a lot of traditional network engineers have faced as they used to really understand how the command line interface works, how to configure a switch in a router, and now you're asking them to do that at scale within a cloud environment, and they're like, well, shit, that's hard. Yes, this is hard, but you have time. I'm giving you like forewarning for you, your teams, whoever it is. I think this is important. And a couple components here that I tend to bring up are, okay, if we're trying to release different versions of software, now we have to start worrying about not only observability and enablement and whatnot, but cybersecurity. I think it's like every day that some new vertical gets hit. It used to be all the healthcare companies got hit. by ransomware, and the lax security, the lax environments, state and local government would often get hit. Now it's like everybody's getting hit by this stuff. You can't ignore this anymore, and it has to be part of the surface area of the things that you're constructing from an API and a services perspective that I thought was interesting. And then I added that last one there, a fun, positive, people-oriented experience. You might think that's a little hippie of me to say, and I certainly will own that, but also don't discredit the value of giving someone a high-quality user experience, right? That's why Facebook won over MySpace. You can dislike that all you want, but like they made a hell of a lot of money off of that. So those things actually do end up mattering, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so that's my soapbox. How did I do? Plus or minus? Okay. Wow, I've never gotten a mid-presentation applause before. I feel like bucket list is being solved here at GDIT. So then I want to compare some of the things to Rubrik. And I'm not here to sell you anything or pitch anything. It's just kind of how do we use these trends? Because ultimately, I think if you purchase what we're offering and get into this ecosystem, you will gain these things as well. So let me rewind your clock to 2004-ish. We'll say 15 years ago. Google comes out. They have the search engine. Everybody knows the search engine. They're beating out Lycos, AltaVista, Metacrawler. Do these names kind of give me nostalgia of dial-up modems? And is anyone nostalgic for a 56K modem? I don't know. And they went out and they said, well, we are running everything in memory for search, and we want to offer more. We'd like to offer mail. And if you'll remember, Google Mail was in beta for like a century, right? But at this point, they didn't have mail yet. And they went out there and they looked at all the technology that existed, and it just wouldn't work. They needed to distribute these applications, distribute the file systems, distribute basically everything. They said, this isn't going to work. We can't work with what exists today. We need to reinvent something new. And so in 2004, they used what they had learned kind of from the search engine world, where they took everything out of memory and actually ran most of Google search on SATA drives, and still would be able to, at the very bottom, I don't know if you search, it says found a bajillion results in 0.0 seconds, right? They're doing that on SATA disk, right? And actually work with some of the people that helped design that, which I got to pick their brain a little bit. But they started with mail, and that was the first application they put on top of the distributed platform, right? And then the same year, they had Picasa come out in the portfolio. That was the photo sharing thing before Google Photos. Probably a little bit of a time machine for some folks. Google Maps, 2005. Can you believe Google Maps is only 14 years old? Can you imagine a world without maps today, on your phone? I was actually talking to a friend, they're like, yeah, you remember you'd go and you download the Yahoo Maps and you print it, and then you turn by turn, and if you got wrong, you're screwed. You have to then find one of those plastic maps from the gas station. YouTube, and you see this, they're just kind of going on. And actually, they built their cloud platform in 2008. So it's 11 years old now. That's kind of crazy. Not the same version of it that was out there. But they took all of that, and within 4 years, they went from how do we do our first application to how do we host other people's applications? And this is just one of the many FANGs, the Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google that exist out there. I didn't know if everybody knew the FANGs terminology there. But it was interesting how they took those learnings and made them accessible for everybody else. And I've worked in the enterprise my whole life. I've been very jealous of what was done there. I used to manage a BlackBerry messaging server. Maybe you still have one of those. Your Bez server. Yeah. Probably still a few of those hanging around. I cut my teeth on what was previously called an AS400. Now it's an I-series. I was a COBOL programmer originally back in the 90s. Helped fix a lot of Y2K bugs for Allstate Insurance. Quit that job because I hated it so much. I'll tell you, fixing date fields in COBOL is literally the definition of self-loathing, right? It's not fun. And so over time, I'm like, I'd really like to do what these folks are doing, but I'm not quite smart enough to work at Google. Like that's not where I'm at, And so Rubrik reached out and said, actually, we're doing a lot of what's going on in this FANGs world, but we want to apply that for the enterprise. There was a lot of folks from like Oracle and VMware and things like that said, we've done this work. We had some Google folks and some Facebook folks. So we want to do that. We want to apply those distributed learnings to something for the enterprise. And I was like, great, because a lot of what I had been doing just prior to that was trying to automate these legacy data protection solutions, which is like self-loathing 2.0, right? There we go. And someone was asking me earlier, so I put this slide in there, like, well, there's no money in that. There's no money. There's literally an application that causes a decrease in productivity called Fortnite It's a video game. I'm sure your kids and whatever have that. That grossed $3 billion, or no, the revenue was $3 billion in 1 year. It's like, holy cow, that little flossing dance thing, like, that makes a lot of money. And I know for some of y'all are like, what is he talking about? It's just a video game where you shoot people and you win. You know, like there's one of 100 people go win. But the interesting thing was Epic Games made $3 billion, and the quote there was the best. That was the headline. It drives down productivity, but it increases overall well-being and whatnot. So I'm like, okay, they took what we learned from these distributed technologies and used them to make a game that was so incredibly successful that it just rained money. Like they are just, whoever made this thing is just on an island somewhere drinking an infinite number of pina coladas. I'm very jealous. That's my life ambition, right? And so what we've done to kind of match that curve was when we brought out Rubrik, it was about 5 years ago. It's a -5 for those in the back of the room. Unfortunately, the ghost area here is the best position to see that. But we offered a product that protected virtual workloads on VMware and archived that to cloud by way of S3 protocol. That was our first application that we put on top of a distributed, scalable infrastructure where all the code is actually services that talk to one another. There's no single point of failure. There's, you know, the database is sharded and replicated and things like that. All of the stuff that kind of the Google world did. We did that. We put our first application on top of it, virtual workloads, right? And it was actually kind of interesting because you know, when your product just protects VMware and puts stuff in S3, you're kind of like, well, how do you sell that? Well, it sold pretty well. I was like, okay, people like this whole distributed architecture, API-driven thing. And then we did database, physical, cloud data protection. We bought a company that lets us do NoSQL, not only SQL type backups. And maybe 12, 13 months ago, we actually released our first software as a service offering called Polaris. If you're interested in how we architect that, I actually had one of the chief scientists and architect on this thing called Cloud Field Day, I think a week or two ago. We actually go into how we constructed it and how the RPC calls work. And it gets really nerdy. You're welcome to it. But within 5 years, we went from our first application all the way to now we can do a control plane based in software as a service, running on demand to all these different workloads that are running wherever they need to be. Cool, yay. What the outcomes are, though, I think are a bit more interesting. And hopefully this connects, because this is my first time doing this particular presentation. I'm still honing it a bit. So you're all my guinea pigs. Thank you very much in advance for that. So first off, I look at, this is a note that one of my principal technologists sent over to me. She's a former, there is no such thing as a former Marine. She's a Marine that works on my team. I'm trying to get that right. I actually was born on Cherry Point. My dad served, but I did not. I was that spoiled brat driving around with the Sergeant Major sticker on my car, just getting through the security and everything, and then realized what was going on. But she had this. She sent me this link that I thought was interesting on the DHS, and there's a lot of data points in this article about why things want to move, and I was like, yes, I agree with many of these points that are made. I kind of like what's going on there. And I just thought it was interesting, like, hey, instead of just saying like everything needs to be cloud, the same mistakes that I think enterprise had made, it was more like, well, let's focus on a few key points here that I want to highlight. First was automation, and that's what my team does entirely. In fact, I'll go into that in just a bit, like what we're going on in the automation world, but I think this is so key. And for the past decade or so, I've been just doing this. I would go into a company, I would automate as much as I can, I would build out a library of different services, wrap them in some kind of software development kit, hand that over to the engineering and the operations team. And then I would kind of put myself out of a job. Maybe not the smartest, I don't know, it felt good. I would automate everything, and then the best story I actually have was I was working for a retail company, we'll say. And it was paying hourly. I was looking for a contract gig, I had just moved in a new place, and they said, we're gonna pay you 40 hours a week to do this task. And it was all manual. And I was like, well, I'm gonna be crafty here. I'm gonna automate it, but I'm not gonna tell anybody. And so 40 hours became 5 minutes. And then my problem was, what do I do for the other 39 hours and 55 minutes? Well, I was young, so I installed a video game at work, and I had the boss key. You remember that? And it would put on like these fake spreadsheets and charts and whatnot, and I'd press that. Eventually I got caught, and my boss goes, I don't mind paying you for the 40 hours, but how did you do that? And I'm like, well, that was not I expected to get fired. And so that was my first foray into this sort of thing. I'm like, oh, cool, this is a valuable skill. I thought I was just cheating. It's like, no, this is kind of what we want. So they ended up hiring me and that kind of jazz. But automation, right? I've spent most of my life trying to do less work, and this helps that, right? So that's kind of my shtick there. Mission support, right? I have a couple keywords in there, cloud out and cloud on. Cloud out is the Rubrik marketing term for taking data on-prem, packaging it up, making it efficient from a data perspective, and putting it into a cloud of your choice. And then cloud on is the process of converting that from whatever its local source was, like a VMware virtual machine or a Hyper-V virtual machine, into something like an EC2 instance or a Azure VM or whatever it needs to be, right? So being able to make it so that the actual topology that you construct for your environment is largely irrelevant when it comes to how the data moves from place to place, I think is important. And I'll unpack that a moment, because as an enterprise architect, most of my constraints are around what I can do from a use case perspective with data. Right? I'm very confined, like, oh, you have these 3 sites? Well, there's a special rule for 3 sites, or this site's over here, and oh, there's a special rule for that, or there are all these caveats. And the biggest job I think anyone can do as an architect is identify risk and try to remediate it. Risk is the enemy. We're always trying to remove it without squashing innovation. And I think being able to have a workload really be wherever you want, could be out in the middle of nowhere, could be right in a data center, could be in a cloud environment, whatever, and making it so that it can move in a fluid fashion from place to place is really what we're all looking for. It's kind of the panacea of data, if you will. So I think being able to make it so that it doesn't matter where the data needs to be, you can still move it around and protect it and put it in the correct format that you need to be, is something I would focus on. I think it's a valuable investment. Decision support, timely decision support, I should say, right? I put this mandate to my team. I've got various managers and whatnot working for me, and I'm like, your job is to make decisions. I don't need them to always be the right decision. I don't even need you to be right. I just need a decision to be made, and eventually we get it right. Right? I've always told the folks, I think actually I was at a meeting with GDIT a few weeks ago. They're like, I don't need to be right, just need to get it right. I totally agree with that, right? And it's tough to do that when there's all these roadblocks in place. There's all these just caveats in place and blockers and whatnot. And so when we have a lot of the intelligence baked into a system that is then distributed, such as with Rubrik, we have the SLA policy that takes the decision that the architect has made and applies that to the data, regardless of it being local, replicated, in the cloud, whatever, then a lot of that timely decision-making is made for you in an automated fashion using intelligent algorithms, rather than having a very expensive resource, such as a sysadmin architect, having to make all of these little decisions that cause what's called decision fatigue. Right? It's literally why Zuckerberg wears that hoodie and the jeans every day. He's like, I need less decisions in my life. So he just wears the same thing every day. I'm not a fan of that. I don't do that. I don't have this isn't just me every day. But I get it, because sometimes people come to you all the time, like these little questions. You're like, it's irrelevant. I don't care. Just make a decision. So I thought that was interesting. Does that happen to y'all much too? I'm from Texas. I say y'all. I apologize. Okay, cool. And then the last one that I had was software as a service. I don't need it to be in a public cloud, but I do, as an architect, really want things to get out of my way for the most part. I'm actually a huge fan of serverless. I use it. I use Cloud Function or Cloud Run. I use Azure Functions. I use Amazon Lambda. I have some stuff on-prem that I use. And the reason I like those technologies is they just get out of my way. I can just write a little bit of code, define inputs, define outputs, and I'm done. And in fact, we have several applications that I published in open source that do these sorts of things, like this chatbot named Roxy. But I think that the more that we can offer service models where we're not relying on a team to own the entire underlay of the stack and just focusing on delivering the service itself, I think is important. And at Rubrik, what we've done is we've actually taken the control plane that guides the decisions and the control of what's being done for Rubrik on-prem. We lifted that into our Polaris software as a service offering, and that's where you can kind of command and control the entire infrastructure, as well as the SLA policies, replication, all that kind of jazz, into one central point. And we put our data management applications on top of that, right? And you kind of saw that curve from before. We're adding more and more applications, like we have intelligent ransomware detection, anomaly and threat detection. We have command and control modules, the ability to talk to public cloud environments, all that kind of stuff. It's all being put at that layer, rather than building these artisanal cheese-like, this is my data center, only Bob knows how it works, and hope nothing ever happens to Bob, because I was Bob for a while too. I have a couple examples. I'm not going to read through it, but basically the theme that you'll see as you look at folks that take this journey with us is they have that time back to work on the actual mission that they're working on, to focus on delivering whatever it is that they're being tasked to deliver at the end of the day, and not mucking about in all these mundane infrastructure decisions that don't ultimately add value to the workflow, right? And it's like, The recovery time objective, how fast can I get these workloads online, decreases. It's faster. The SLA policy-driven nature of the product creates a massive amount of time savings. In fact, I was working with a customer up in the Pacific Northwest, and it's a bunch of data scientists that their job is like, we're researching ways to cure cancer. I'm like, that's a great mission. I'm down with that. And he said, what's interesting was him and his team were spending 10 to 20 hours a week just managing data, right? Data protection and whatnot, because the scientists needed the information into their various like satellite labs, and they just replicate it out now using Rubrik, bring it up, and it's all there. And he's like, you're saving us about 85 to 90% of the time we were spending on these things so we can support what they're actually trying to do, which is cure cancer. I was like, that's awesome. Like, that's the kind of stuff we're looking to do. Or the security is now higher because we're offering end-to-end encryption, right? The way the product's been constructed, there's no point in time where the data is not encrypted. It's at rest, in flight. Even the way our product talks to itself is signed and encrypted, because that would be a breach otherwise if you didn't have those sorts of things. So I just thought those were some interesting stories that I would bring up of other people that were having success. And, oh yeah, I forgot. The last thing that I thought was interesting. Anybody follow Gartner? You follow them? Yeah. You've heard of them, that kind of thing. This was an interesting quote. I don't know how many people believe it or not, but they said by 2021, 80% of data that's retained, typically in an unstructured fashion, is going to be an object store. No longer using block store, file store, those big cabinet-sized, refrigerator-sized pieces of storage. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So if that's true, we've got 2 years left until the massive bulk of data is now, even if it's unstructured, it's in a queryable manner. It's exposed to an API, they can potentially start mining it, and I think that's what people are trying to do. Even backup data can be applicable for this situation. And so I have a whole team of folks that are working on a bunch of open source projects related to managing data, integrating our solution with other people's solutions, building out use cases, developing software development kits, and we've made it all open source. And you can go to that now, it's build.rubrik.com, and you can check out what we're doing. You can see how we think about this technology, how we think about managing data at that kind of scale, and ultimately then the power is yours. You can choose what you want to do with these things. And very timely. I just saw that movie the other day. Wow, it was so awesome. I really loved it. It's like, I want to watch. I can't wait for Endgame too. That's next week. So I'm at 3 minutes and some change. I don't know if there's a question or whatnot you want to ask. Otherwise, I'll be out there drinking coffee.